What's up, dude?
What's up? You in a new apartment, or did you just have a new table / new angle?
Sorry.
You in a new apartment, or you just have a new table / angle?
This is just a new angle.
I'm digging it. Oh, I can see. Yeah, I can see the plants when you're sitting on your couch. There it is.
Hey everybody, give people maybe one more minute to show up and then get started. Feel free to sign into please sign into the working group meeting agenda doc and add anything to the agenda that you'd like to chat about this week. Sorry if somebody said that before I joined also. All right, let's get started. So first thing on the list is introductions and new faces. I don't see any new faces here. Is there anybody who wants to introduce themselves who doesn't normally show up?
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm on the Buildpacks feature engineering team.
At VMware.
Right.
Welcome.
All right, and I don't think we have anybody else who doesn't usually show up, so I'll move on to release planning and updates.
On the lifecycle side, I think we're ready to cut a patch release with a couple bug fixes. The last thing we're doing for this release is finally moving all of our release automation from Concourse to GitHub Actions. And Natalie and Yael are working on that. And as soon as we have the automation moved over, we'll be ready to cut that patch. So coming up soon.
Awesome. Any other release planning updates? Cool. Next thing is our very quick 10-minute RFC review. Give me 1 second to share my screen. Everybody see that? Sorry, fixing my Zoom. Okay. First thing, RFC build run image configs must contain env path. Do we have Micah here? Doesn't look like it. Anybody know status of this?
This is something that came up as a bug in the life cycle, but instead of all of the workarounds to make this, first of all, this is specifically about Windows images, where sometimes path is defined in the Windows registry in a Windows container rather than being defined in the environment that you would normally find in the image config. And that creates some complexities when we want to do things like update the path by prepending something to it while just using the image config without having to dive into Windows layers that describe the registry. So I think the proposal is that for Windows stack images, this should be set in the image config. And if it is, it always takes precedent over the registry. So makes things simpler for the lifecycle. But it is a requirement that didn't exist before that on Windows images.
So it seems like without Micah here, we probably don't want to add it to the agenda this week. We'll just leave discussion open in the RFC, and maybe you could talk about it at a future meeting.
He was here at the start of the meeting, but I don't know what happened.
I thought I saw him too. I thought I was crazy.
Maybe we can put it at the end of the agenda in case he comes back.
Yeah, somebody want to stick it there, and then if he shows up again, then there's time at the end we can chat about it. Distribution team.
On the list for today.
Cool. Application mixins and stack Buildpacks. I put something there.
Yeah.
Buildpacks should be able to provide default process types for an app. Do we have
We
Natalie?
should add that to the list. We can do that. There was a lot of discussion last week, but not all the participants were present.
Yeah, I hope I was able to summarize some of it in my comment. But
yeah,
you good to talk about again.
Awesome. RFC relax mixin contract. This is mine. I think this is still waiting on me to integrate. Emily had some feedback. We're going to do one thing, but not another thing. I still need to make those changes. It looks like you had another comment here.
No, that's just fixing, adding the URL in. It's not super important.
Cool. Next one, label RFCs with spec. This is an FCP. Do we need to just merge it yet? Is it past the closing September 7? We're past this.
Yep.
This can go on.
I'll take that.
Cool. Sub-team maintainer, formerly author creates repo issues. I think this is still ongoing discussion here.
Not so much. I think it's more just votes.
So this is looking to call for votes for what we reached. Excuse me. All right. RFC for project descriptor flexibility. Where are we with that?
I should probably move this back in draft, but it's something Joe and I need to talk to some of our product folks about what they want to kind of do next for some of that.
Do you want me to put it in draft for you?
Just click the button.
Cool. There we go. Layer origin metadata draft, experimental features. This was, Joe, you were calling for votes. Did people actually vote? I didn't vote.
Yeah, Terrence had a question that I kind of stumbled on, requesting that we make it obvious that it is experimental, I guess, so like a warning or something. So if anyone, I feel like not the person to make a call on that. So like, Javier, I don't think Javier is here, but if anybody on the platform team in particular has thoughts on that, what that sort of indication would be.
Yeah, David, do you have some input on how you, like whether you'd want such a thing or what it might look like if you did?
In terms of what, whether, how to transition something from experimental?
I think Terrence, you can...
Yeah, go ahead, Terrence.
Yeah, I had two comments, but yeah, the one Joe's talking about is just like some way to just make it clear something's experimental. Especially if it sounds like Emily was saying that we wanted to limit this potentially even to more platform pack stuff, because as a thing, but like how that would look like. And my other comment was a path where I don't want to have pack filled with like a bunch of like just accumulate experimental features over time, and that there actually is a road to either sunset or move things into kind of official things that aren't experimental.
Cool. It seems like we can keep the discussion going, maybe in the issue, or if you want to add it to the agenda, we can chat about it with a little more time there. The last one is offline build packages RFC.
Yeah, so I think I added some comments here at the end of last week, trying to get some feedback about the direction that we should go with this.
Do you want to add it to the agenda this week, or?
Happy to. I think that, yeah.
I recall this is waiting on some feedback from Emily and Ben. I think there's a thread in Slack and some questions there.
Oh.
Cool. All right. And that's it for RFC review. So I'm gonna stop sharing and move back to the doc. Next thing on the list is new platform contributor.
That'll be me. I am pleased to announce on behalf of the platform maintainers that Dan Thornton has been elected as a contributor to the platform team. Congratulations, Dan.
Thank you.
Awesome. And next thing on the list is distribution team.
Yeah, so I opened a RFC for creation of a distribution team that I have to find I can't remember what this team does. I have to look up the text. But the TLDR is that this team would have ownership or responsibility for the Buildpack registry repositories, which right now are the registry index, which follows, the specification we defined in the earlier RFC, and then the registry namespace repository, which does not follow a specification, but that's how we maintain an ownership of mapping between GitHub users and the namespaces for the Buildpack registry. So right now, those are the only two repositories, but we could, and I should probably add this to the RFC, but we could definitely imagine some things being split out of Pack that are either like libraries or utilities that have to do with creating build packages, interacting with the registry as a client. Those could potentially in the future become a part of that team's responsibility.
Awesome. Any thoughts or comments? I see, David, you mentioned the word distribution and some questions about the word distribution. So we're talking about.
My like concern was just like, I feel like distribution sounded like I wasn't sure I was trying to figure out what we were distributing as part of it, but I think Javier had a clarification there.
Any other questions?
I appreciate the adjustment in it with Circle CI also, because I was trying to figure out what the connection was between those. So that clarification.
Yeah, it was just kind of arbitrary. I think it makes a lot more sense like this.
Cool. All right. If there's nothing else on that, next thing on the agenda is stack metadata.
This is going to be pretty rocky because I actually don't know what the problem is here. There is an issue, spec or spec PR open from Cashup around platform spec for stack metadata, and there appears to be some confusion on the version number for a particular stack. Does anyone who's complained about that want to talk a little bit more about their concerns?
I can describe what the question is. Hold on, let me open up this PR to the spec so we can take a look at it together. And I can share the screen. Is that the right one? Are you guys seeing spec metadata?
Yeah, 89.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think the question is, this is something we sort of approved as a group in the RFC, but specifically around the stack version label, which seems to imply that stacks as a whole are versioned rather than run images and build images. And I think one of the questions was, so let's say my build image has I cut many releases of my build image or push out a new version of my build image more frequently than my run image, which is plausible given that build images usually have more packages installed on them. At that point, in order for this label to be valid on each of the stack images, if you wanted to bump the version, would you then end up having to continually cut new versions of your run image just to bump that number if nothing's changing? That's sort of like the practical distillation of when this could be a problem. More abstractly, it's, are these images versioned in lockstep together as a stack? Or do we want to consider versioning them separately? Because having a single label that says stack version has implications that everyone would have to version them in lockstep.
I'll give you my,
sure.
Sorry. I'll give you my opinion in order of practical and theoretical. So practically, it means retagging an existing SHA with a new version number, which is really, unless you're worried about a situation where you're cutting a lot of GitHub releases that correspond to the images.
Not retagging a SHA as a label, right? So you're pushing a new version of the image config, so you get a new image digest and ID.
Oh, because you'd have to put the new version number in the config blob of the image. Oh, that's interesting, actually. Should we require that the stack version be in the image labels? Yeah, that makes sense.
Or we're not requiring it in the spec change, but we're recommending it. And it does seem like it might cause some problems for image. It might generate a lot of image versions that it wouldn't be necessary otherwise.
Maybe we could take that out of should and make it a can or something. That's definitely something to think about. It hurts the kind of reproducibility a little bit, right? You'd be doing rebases that you didn't have to do. It's not reproducibility really. It's just creating unnecessary work. So I'd support figuring out a better solution to that. More theoretically, the thing that I'm interested in is, do we presume that there's a compatibility guarantee where you could build on an older run image? Like if you build something on a build image, we presume that all future run images work with the app built using that build image, because that's the whole point of rebasing. Do we make the same assumption backwards? Because if we do, then there's really not a very strong link between these images anyways. But if we don't, then there is a pretty strong link between the images, where you would imply that you'd want to understand what the associated run image to a build image version is. And I would kind of support saying you can't go back super far, because then it prevents you from ever making additive changes to both images. And so that would imply a link between the two. And then we're just down to the more minor decision about whether we should put the version information inside of the image, as opposed to a larger theoretical decision about whether there should be associated image versions.
Or if we want to make this hyper theoretical, is the stack version more like a spec version, and then different releases of the images actually they have their own release number or some other mechanism, right? Because we said that a stack is a contract that's implemented by a build and run image. So if you have to agree about what a certain stack ID implies, you could still have different images that meet that requirement produced by different vendors. That might make it a number that's different than just which version of this image have I shipped.
I think you're suggesting that there'd be two numbers, right? A number that represents that, contractual, like you can't make breaking changes, but a number that represents additive changes, a number that represents just security patches, right? Where you haven't changed the interface, you're changing completely, you're making proper patch changes, right? But we have a version number that, can be somewhere to be able to represent those different changes there. So it's
Don't we already have that? Isn't that the one right above it? Distro version is essentially the contractual version. You are 1804 or whatever, and you get to make the changes that are compatible with 1804.
That's like the major version. I think we're talking about minor and patch, which is like, technically right now, I think you can add, say you want to add image magic to an existing stack image, or, we have Mixins to represent that, but there's nothing that would break anybody for making a purely additive change to a stack image, right? As long as you don't revert the run image to older versions than the associated build image you built it for.
Well, I think that's true if you assume there's only one distribution of an image. But even then you run into problems where, let's say you've made a purely additive change and someone creates a build pack that says it runs on that stack. It might not run on a different image that says it's that stack. At that point, then you need to, our idea of compatibility, what it means to say a build pack is compatible with a stack, needs to take in another coordinate, whereas right now we assume ID says everything it needs to say.
No one should ever use old stack versions of anything because they have security vulnerabilities, right? This is the continuous release of API compatible changes, right? So that's tricky space.
What do you think about this in terms of something like the Bionic stack, right? That's something we're saying the project is defining what it means, but the project isn't releasing implementations of it. So you might want to describe an additive change that we have made as a project to that definition, but that if you're versioning that, it's not going to include whether there actually is a patched version of something in it, because there's nothing to ship there. There's a contract that's being incremented separately.
That's a good point. That would suggest two separate schemes for versioning, right?
Maybe we can just pull a version for now and then come back to it because it's more confusing.
Yeah.
That was going to be my suggestion, that we've made a mistake here and we actually just don't want version at all.
Tags are good, sufficient for version for now, I think.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I had an unrelated question, so I'd support removing a version from that if someone wants to put in there. I had an unrelated question about release date. Is it underscore in that? Do we, in other places in our labels, do we use camel case underscore something? I thought we were using camel case in other places, but I could just be misremembering.
I can't think of any example where we do this. Usually it's just a dot at that point, but I guess for a compound word like this, I don't know. I don't think we have a relevant example.
Give me a moment to look at the OCI recommendations.
I think that's the only other thing I would change besides removing the version.
I guess maybe the question there is because an image already has a created date built into the image spec itself, do you need a separate release date in the label? But also that one doesn't seem as problematic to me. So
yeah, but I would change it to the verbified form. That's how OCI has no 2-word recommendations, but they use created instead. Oh, I guess they do have actually an image ref name, and it's ref.name for the two. But I would just change that to stack.released, and its definition is it must be an ISO 8859 date or something like that.
Okay. We can leave these comments for Kasha. This one's not my baby. I was just the one who was raising questions.
I will take care of doing that.
I see an example with a dash in Docker's docs, but I don't know if that makes sense. Actually, I see a few examples with dashes when even for a release dash date in one place in the Docker documentation. So dash may be if we needed that, I don't really care how it looks as long as it's, if there is a multi-part thing, we should probably use dash instead of underscore. But I see released in several places also as a, yeah, okay. Anyways. Anything else on stack metadata? Cool.
I am satisfied.
At Mixins, Stackpack questions. I put this here just because I kind of read through everything a little earlier today and had some high level questions, but I see people put a lot of other stuff there too.
Yeah, it was just me. You can go ahead and talk if you want.
My thing is actually pretty small. I couldn't find the part where a build pack, where we defined what it looks like for a build pack to require mixins in the build plan. I might have just missed it. That was the biggest comment I had. I haven't submitted my review yet.
Yeah, no, it wasn't defined, I think. That's what Jason was asking about as well. Let me show this. You said an app?
For a build pack to request mixins from the stack pack using the build plan, what that looks like. I thought Jason was asking.
Well, he was talking about build plan in general, not just with just the right one, not just with the mixins. I think that's something, at least in my mind, that was something we had talked about being possible, but was not really in scope yet. Like the main problem we were trying to solve was application developer puts mixins in their project toml or something like that, and totally intend that Buildpacks will be able to sort of like dynamically request mixins, and in the implementation I'm working on, I'm taking that into account, but I haven't drawn it up in the RFCs at all.
I kind of thought that was a core use case for it, or like, the point is Buildpacks.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is. It's just, I was trying to, there's already a lot to think about. So I guess I was just trying to like draw the line somewhere. mean, if you think it's important enough, I would actually probably open a third RFC to go alongside the application Mixins one, where again, it's sort of independent of the Stackpacks, just so that people can consume it a little bit more easily in the future. But yeah, I wasn't sure, Jason had some questions there. I wasn't sure, if we intended those to be just regular entries in the build plan with some key, or if, Mixin is like a new construct alongside provides and requires. And yeah, I'm curious to hear what you think about it.
The consistency of the interfaces is what I'm most concerned about at this point, because I think we have a pretty good underlying model for it, right? Like Stackpacks install packages based on information they receive, externally, and they can rerun on both images, and we have how snapshotting works when you have to replay things, right? The things I'm most concerned about are like, are we creating a consistent interface for build pack authors and app authors? And it's like, I don't think we need to define all the details of that contract. Without seeing like, are all the keys going to make sense? Like in one place we had Mixins as a table, and then you have to say names equals under it. And that's really inconsistent with other places where you have Mixins equals, and then you have the Mixin names directly, right? It's a little hard for me to, seeing all the schemas there would be helpful, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're in there now. Like there is none. Like there's nothing that I'm defining. Or you're saying because you'd like to see it in the build plan. Like everything that's in these two RFCs is complete in the sense that like there's not like some hidden file that I haven't talked about or something like that. All the like Mixin names versus Mixins as an array and all that is, I think, resolved. There's just between the two RFCs, I think it's covered. If you think we need to flesh the build plan out, I mean, we can do that. I don't think it'll change the implementation at all. So,
do we imagine that the build plan functionality will land in early implementation of this, or if users want to install packages, it'll always be an app developer who has to put the Mixin list in Project Toml, and that's the only interface?
I don't know. It really is just going to be a question of priorities on our side. This is the thing I think that we need the most, the application developers. It's also about the project adoption, right? Like, I know that this is blocking a lot of people. So it's not even our internal priorities that are driving this at this point.
I feel like the way we've architected it to support application provided Mixins, it almost just works for Buildpack provided ones as well. Like if you think about the application provided Mixins as an additional require, the same way like a Buildpack would have a require, then if a Buildpack required something, it would also just hook into the same mechanism, sort of without any changes beyond that, right?
Yeah, and that goes along with a question that Jason had somewhere else in here about, or maybe it was in the email chain with him. They're a little hesitant about the Project Toml, so they were curious, what's the other mechanism that they would use to require Mixins? But that's an a platform concern right now. But if it was something that could go in with the build plan, that gives platforms a little bit easier way than like, implement your own logic to compare the static list of Mixins that are provided to what's requested and all that.
I guess I don't want us to say this is how a user provides Mixins via Project Toml and then come up with a special interface in the lifecycle and then later realize that all of that should have been funneled through the build plan. And we need to make a big change because, there's like a more unified mechanism for the flow of the information through the build process. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can we do that without, I don't know, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's just necessary. I'm just trying, like, this thing is getting really unruly. And I'm trying to like break it down. It's just like, to something that we can ship, you know? So I'm just like, I mean, that all makes sense. I'm just a little bit worried about it increasing in scope instead of decreasing in scope.
That makes sense. Maybe just a section for subsequent RFC will define the build plan thing, but this is what it could look like, you know, and then that way we can imagine how that, you know, someone trying to implement this or write the spec PR, we can imagine how that information will get funneled through the build plan, even if the build plan interface isn't open yet, more generally.
Right, that makes sense. But in the interim, are you comfortable with just requiring that platforms sort of manually look at the static list of mixins that can or are provided from Stackpacks and compare that to what the application needs with no like spec'd out interface? It's just like platforms do that.
Isn't that the lifecycle's responsibility in the end? Like subtracting the list of the requirements, the app requirements from the things on the current stack and then providing that to the Stackpacks?
Where does that happen? I don't know, actually.
I would assume that's something the lifecycle would do. Like the lifecycle has some input. It's like, here are mixins. I feel like that should be all through the build plan, if that makes sense. Here are the mixins we need for the app. And then it doles them out.
Are you talking about today? Are you talking about today or in the future?
In the future, as defined in the RFC.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sure. But today it's just the platform that handles that, right?
I feel like the piece of information that's missing right now is Lifecycle doesn't know what mixins have been installed and what haven't, but it easily could. And then you can subtract those. So if someone requires a mixin, I feel like usually if a Buildpack requires something, another one has to provide it for it to match. I feel like for mixins, there's an extra step where it's the required things minus the things that exist need to match a provided thing, right? Does that make sense? That's what you were saying, basically. The same thing, right, Stephen?
Exactly, yeah. I think we can maybe, this might be easier conversation to have over some line comments and, you know, specific corrections in the RFC. Or like, Joe, I'm guessing you want some actionable, can we put this here? And suggestions for additions as opposed to.
Yeah, and if you can, like this particular comment that I have up here, given that you probably have stronger opinions about the build plan, if you have take on that, I'd appreciate just dealing with that.
Yeah. Should a stack pack be able to say, no, I'm not going to install this and kick it forward to the next stack pack, for instance? If two stack packs in a row say they're installing everything, we have a mechanism like that for the current build plan, right? Suddenly this starts to feel a lot like the build plan, the way it's working. And that's kind of why I'm, like questions like this are a little bit, like why I'm afraid of not bringing the build plan into this a little sooner, because it really seems like this follows very similar patterns, if that makes sense. But happy to kind of work on that in the RFC.
Yeah, that makes sense. The other thing on the list was that Project TOML thing I was asking about, but I think that interface would be the build plan. I think that's probably where we would land with that. So, and then I need to know a little bit more about that run builder conversation that we started having in Slack, but I think maybe we should kick that over to tomorrow and just have a longer conversation.
Sounds good. Let's talk about run builder tomorrow. I think that makes sense. There's definitely a kind of an important interface we have to figure out there. It's how does the stack back in on the run image?
Yep.
Cool. I thought I had one. Let's move on to the path and image config. We have Micah here.
Yeah.
Who can talk about it?
Sure thing. I guess I'll share my screen if that works. So yeah, thank you all. I had just added this one, I think yesterday or the day before. So if y'all hadn't had a chance to look at it, no problem. Also, excuse the noise in the background. Sorry, we got kid duty. It's my normal kid watching time. So let me know if that gets too bad. The gist of the RFC is to solve a mismatch between Windows and Linux images. The gist is that Linux images will always have a config env path set, just like it's impossible to use Docker to create an image without a path set. A from scratch image or our tiny images that we regularly use will always set a config path environment variable. But Windows doesn't do the same thing. It prefers a different mechanism for getting the value of the path, but it still supports that same mechanism of setting a path environment variable on the image config. So the proposal of the spec, sort of the gist of it all, is to really just codify the Linux behavior to say that a path is always required on an image config, both for a run image and for a build image. And the consequence the fallout of it is that for Windows, it solves or it makes our Windows images always behave the same way as the Linux images. Like when it's going through the lifecycle, the app images that we're generating, lifecycle now puts path environment variables inside of the image config. For Linux, it all works great. For Windows, they're incomplete. I referred a little bit to there's this alternate mechanism for getting the Windows path value. It actually comes from the registry layers, that like Hive section of the OCI images. Like all the details are in the RFC about how that part of the mechanism works. But I think what we generally want to do is, for CNB purposes, not use that registry mechanism at all. It's hard to inspect. It's stored in proprietary format that we can't access except at runtime. And instead, we just take the path that we want our final app images to have and the path that we want the build images to have, and we just stick them right in the image config. And so if we do that, then Windows images and Linux images look about the same, and it makes CNB stuff a whole lot easier. I have a whole bunch of pros and cons with, or I guess pros mostly for this part of the RFC, and then some drawbacks down here, namely that it adds a little bit more work for a stack author to go and find out what that variable should be, and then to duplicate it onto their image config. But yeah, that's the gist. And again, I know it's only been a little while, so I don't expect to have any motion on this one, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
How common is it in both Linux and Windows to have path not set? You said it's common on Windows not to have path set. I think it's most Linux Docker images I've seen have path set in env, or it'd be weird not to. Pretty sure. So I guess more on the Windows side then, or is it going to be a value that is always generally set to the same thing, or like, is there a reason why we want the information to be there if, path doesn't tend to vary on Windows images? Can we make an exception for Windows and treat path differently there? Just general questions about that. I don't know if they make sense.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this is an interesting little experiment I did. I just did like a one-liner Docker file for a from scratch. And what's interesting, if you do a from scratch, you need at least one other thing in there. So I just put an environment variable in there. But a from scratch image from Docker will always set a full, very robust path value, which I thought was pretty surprising.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to accidentally make an image without a path on Linux. But if you do somehow manage to do that, if you were to remove this value, or if you're building up your manifest from scratch, which maybe isn't too far-fetched, it would be very weird what was going on. You probably wouldn't see a problem until you've created your builder, made your app image, and then tried to run your app image, and then ran it with something that needed bash. That would probably be the very first time that you'd actually see anything wrong. This is all in the Linux case, because this is what happened in the Windows case. All right. So
In
I
some
feel
ways
like
that Linux case is more broken than the Windows case, though, because if you don't set this in the environment in the Windows case. Like you couldn't, Docker run the image and start the CMD shell. I mean, you can do that in the Windows case because path is set somewhere else. In the Linux case, there just would be no path at all, which is different, right?
Yeah, the consequences would be worse for Linux, but I still suspect that you wouldn't see it manifest until long after you've, like if a stack author were to do this by accident, they wouldn't see it, and like they wouldn't notice it until their app users started to see it. I could poke at that a little bit if we did want to verify if this really is a case worth including for Linux.
There's no reason for a scratch image with a Go binary in it to have paths set in the environment. That's like, it's really gross. I don't know why they do that. But
right.
Yeah, but it seems like it's not going to cause a problem for Linux images to define that it always has to be there, because practically no one's going to bring in a stack image and forget to add path to it and it cause a problem. So I don't have strong opinions about that. On the Windows side, if I'm making a Windows Docker image, how do I provide, and I want to customize the path, right? What's the normal way of doing that when I'm building a Windows Docker image?
It's a good question. I'm bringing up the samples repo right now. And in here, we actually have the image config way of doing it. This would be the run image. It's going to be in the base, excuse me. So this would be the proposed way to have a stack author define that. Honestly, it's the only documented Docker recommended way of doing it. There were 2 failed attempts to support an alternative way of doing it. Docker worked for a while, a lot of back and forth actually on 2 different alternative syntaxes. One would be like a getenv instruction for Docker files that would allow you to read an existing environment and then modify it. This is mainly to allow you to avoid explicitly putting the entire path in there and instead prepend it and modify it. Prepending and modifying it works fine for Linux, but for Windows, they were trying to come up with these alternative syntaxes because it didn't just work out of the box. So the short, long answer made short. There isn't any other Docker official way of setting any environment variable except this way for Windows.
Got it.
The other way, which isn't specific to the Docker file, right, would be in your Docker file in a run directive, execute a command that modifies the registry to change the environment value.
What worries me though is that's not anywhere in the Docker documentation. And it feels like there's a lot of attempts to make that not the way to do it. And so I worry a little bit about relying too much on that being the way to do it in Windows. Like for a few different reasons.
I don't want us to do it that way. I want what's in this RFC. But I feel like that is a thing that, at least when I was Googling it, some people are doing, whether or not Docker recommends it.
Yeah, it makes a 5 megabyte size layer to contain pretty much just this. It lets you do stuff like this. You could, append something to it, my stuff. So because it's the run layer, it's going to make a bunch of changes to the file system.
There is a chance that people bringing their own images will have used this strategy to set path, and their images won't work with this designation. And so you need to document clearly that, no, this is the way you're supposed to do it here, even if it's more limiting because you can't reference the existing value. Is that right?
Right. Yep. Yeah, and I would, the catch too is that there's not a great way to sort of help them along the way to find that, at least from a platform's perspective. It's easiest to find that value at runtime. So you might need to tell them in the documentation, do a command. I think I mentioned this in here. To do something like Docker run, not that one. Something like Docker run base image, echo out your path if you're bringing your own image.
Got it.
That's obviously not in the spec, and we could add a little bit more language if we wanted to make that either show up an error message from a platform or make it required, but we definitely want some documentation like that, whether it's spec or not.
Cool. I think I'm okay with the change. And I don't want to eat up the rest of the time if I know we have a couple more things on the agenda. Anybody else have? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, definitely don't feel we need to make a decision now. I don't want to eat up all the time too.
Cool. Any other questions? I wanted to make sure we had a chance to get to Buildpacks contributing default process types. This is Natalie's. Yeah, sorry.
So I added this one. It wasn't here last week, but it was discussed at length at Wednesday's meeting. And I mean, I just want to encourage anyone who's interested in that discussion to watch the recording. There was a lot of ideas bounced around. I'm not sure how in depth we want to go here, but I believe there may be some opinions that weren't aired last time. I don't know if anyone wants to speak to the use case for this thing.
I'll confess that I didn't watch the recording of the meeting that I missed last week, but I did see the summary comment. I think it was mentioning that, Stephen, you were saying that you think this is more of a platform level concern. Is that like a good summary of what the major arguments against this are?
I just got back from vacation, so I don't remember all the little details of what we talked about there, but I think at the high level, what I think my argument was is that process types are like highly conventional, like, web or worker or, sorry, go ahead.
I challenge that. I challenge that particular assumption. They have been to date, but the very first thing that we would do over on our implementations is delete all of the conventional ones and only leave the very explicit of a type kind of process types later on. Right now, we have tons of duplication to meet convention, and we would prefer not to have to do that to meet convention.
I would also say that the convention is usually within a Buildpack ecosystem, which is why it makes sense to delegate this to Buildpacks to me. So like if, let's say the Paketo Buildpacks decided to change, they wanted their conventional default process type to be Paketo default. Bad name choice, but we could do it, why not? I feel like it makes sense to convey that convention like in the build packs. It shouldn't have to be a change that platform, like even if most people using Kpack use it with Paketo build packs right now, it wouldn't necessarily be a Kpack level concern because Kpack should be able to work very well with Heroku build packs as well, right? Sort of like the convention of how the process types are named is a decision made by the build packs, and therefore the build packs should be indicating what the default is supposed to be.
This interface where all the build packs can contribute process types, and the later ones override the earlier ones. And then you have another abstraction on top of that where all the build packs can contribute a default process type, and then the later defaults override the earlier defaults. Something seems very weird.
The other thing you do is name the process default, but I feel like then you lose something nice, which is you might actually want to give that process a name, right?
But I think the purpose of them having separate names and still being able to override each other is that you're deferring the decision for which one gets run to something that's not the things that wrote the original process types. It's like, why are we creating two levels of abstraction of selecting the start command that are both controlled by the same thing, right? Why not? Like, isn't the selecting the process type, we're giving them names and allowing later ones to override earlier ones and how they're defined, isn't the purpose of that to come up with a list where then the decision of which thing to run can be deferred to something else?
The problem with deferring it to the platform, though, means that a given build pack, which is intended to be interoperable, may only work on one platform, right? Like if Heroku and Kpack have chosen different default names for whatever reason, it means that a set of build packs that work on Heroku won't work on KPack, right? They cannot build an image that can be executed without, specifying a new entry point, for example. And like that feels really problematic to me, because what we're actually aiming for is this level of interoperability. Buildpacks should be able to make something that you can just Docker run or just throw into Kubernetes and have it execute. And if you depend on a platform to make that happen, you end up with odd non-portable behavior.
In that case, I feel like we should standardize on one particular process type name that's the default everywhere, as opposed to
I just disagree. And also, like, as people compose these things together, they might stomp on each other in unexpected ways, trying to make sure that there is a default process, right?
Oh, exactly. Like I'll speak to this in Paketo right now. We have 5 different, so like on the Java side, there are like 15 build packs, but 5 of them contribute command lines. And we have intentionally listed both web and task, which are well-known names that sort of the Cloud Foundry platform understands. But then we also have to put in jar native image. And so like every single build pack, instead of writing one process type, writes 3 process types: A, so that it can satisfy the default requirement, and B, so that it can also give you the ability to execute if you one of the other process types that might have gotten lost because they were shadowed later on in the default. And so all you're doing is just like continually redefining the defaults over and over and over again, and having to put in unique names to guarantee that people can get back to them. You haven't actually solved any problems by having a specified default there.
Like, you want a set of processes and you want one of them to be the default. I feel like being able to give them each meaningful names and say which of the meaningful names is the default feels better than putting that in the same mechanism, right?
The other thing I was worried about is I dislike it when we add more things to the spec that make the order of the build packs especially relevant. And this makes the order, like things later can set a default process type and creates interesting, like, oh, it's setting a default process type to something that actually gets overridden later. Like something says, okay, I'm going to write my jar and set the default to my jar, and then something later doesn't write my jar but sets the default to it, or like there's some interesting combinations we can end up with that are due to the preferentially supporting the decisions of later build packs over earlier build packs. And I like in that API how we've avoided creating that imbalance a little bit.
But it hasn't, right? Like right now, if you specify web later on, you basically take precedence because your order, like inside of our builder or our order definitions, there's actually a comment that said this section of build packs is ordered to determine preference, and you can't reorder them, or if you choose to reorder them, you change the preference. Your concern about sort of a later thing specifying a new default without specifying a command, or specifying a command without specifying it, and it sort of shadows a default. Like, I think that is a valid concern. I asked Emily about this a little bit earlier. I think default should only be able to refer to something, to a process type you have also contributed. So if you say, I want to be default and I want to be called foo, and then somebody later on just says, I want to be foo, and redeclares it, it doesn't do the second foo. It only does the first foo, ends up being the command. So I think we can iron out some of those edge cases there, but I don't think it fundamentally changes the idea that like a build pack has a very clear idea of which of its process types are candidates to be the default process type.
There's also the concept of override. We sort of added that additional key in the default process section to say, I think the default process should be X, but override false. So I don't want to stomp on the default process declared by another build pack, or an earlier build pack, I guess, is a thing that would be possible in the proposal.
That solves the problem, that definitely helps, end up with a better decision. But I worry that we're creating a lot of complexity around something that I wonder if, because we started with this concept of highly conventional process types coming from Cloud Foundry and Heroku, I wonder if we're creating a complex system to deal with that concept we've created instead of creating a system that solves the underlying problem. But I could be wrong. I'm not adamantly opposed to this.
I think we're trying to solve the underlying problem by getting rid of the highly conventional process type names.
There are things like, should process types be able to reference each other? Should you be able to, wrap a process, like, and the subsequent Buildpacks invocation should, the web as a binary refer to the web process type from the previous process type, like it works at launch when you can use, process types added to the path, right? Like, there's maybe a more functional system we want to create eventually, and I worry a little bit about how this will interplay with that. But it's not a reason to block it. I'll read through and think about it more. I forget everything we talked about last time, though. I feel like there was a very detailed conversation there where good points were brought up too. We are at time. We didn't get a chance, Dan, to chat about offline build packages. Is that something we could chat about tomorrow? I know we already have app Mixins for tomorrow too, but would you be able to make that time?
Yes, I will.
Cool. Maybe we could try to split the time between the app Mixin stuff and offline build packages. I know Ben and Emily are interested in that too. If you want to take a look at some of the comments that have been made there, it might be good. I think there's a Slack thread that Dan started to get to respond to. All right. Thanks, everybody.